Hi, welcome to Module 2 of Organizational Behavior course. I wanted to start out our second module by talking about perception. Eventually we'll talk a little bit more about other individual areas of concern and integration within organizations. I've got a couple definitions up here. The first, perception is a mental process that we use to understand our environment. In other words, it's about sense making sense out of the stimuli around us. Social perception is the process of gathering, selecting, and interpreting information about ourselves and how we fit into our surroundings, including our organizations. So here's a more scholarly academic definition. The process of receiving information, and then here it talks about making sense of the world around us. I think that adequately describes it and gives us an idea about what we're talking. Of course, we all come into this concept of perceiving the world around us with different lenses, different backgrounds, different value systems, experiences that color how we perceive. So it's not as easy to get our heads wrapped around as we might think. In perceiving the world around us, we often use what we call mental models. It is not possible to actually absorb all the stimuli around us. So much is going on in the world around us all the time in terms of audio cues, visual cues, interruptions, what I call noise in the environment. And so we do a thing subconsciously in which we filter the sounds and the stimuli that we are receiving and choose which to actually pay attention to. And in doing so, we fit these into our worldview or the world as we know it based on our experiences and how in our education, culture, all kinds of things. And we fit them we fit the stimuli into models in which it makes sense to us. So for instance, if every time you open the door, somebody throws a punch at you, and this happens 3 times in a row, pretty soon you're going to begin to develop a model wherein every time you open the door, someone throws a punch. So, as I mentioned, culture can be extremely important in our perception and how we view the world around us. We talked a little bit about this in the last module and in the reading for both last time and this time. So I hope you'll explore that a bit more. You can see that one of the references that I use is Hofstede, and we did talk about his work at IBM in discovering various country cultures and the similarities within each of those cultures and what makes them unique. In doing so, in looking at the world around us, we attribute what we see to a certain cause or a behavior. This is what we call the attribution process. And one of the aspects of this is to decide if it's an internal or external cause. I put a little diagram up here. I believe this may have come from your textbook. I've also used some other sources here, so some of this information is in addition to what you're reading, not exactly what you read in your textbook. So if it's an internal attribution, it's coming from inside of us, which makes sense. External means that we're attributing the cause of the stimuli or the event around us to something that is outside of our control. And this becomes important, particularly as a manager or supervisor, as we look at others' actions and we attribute them to a specific source. So in looking at, say, employee behavior or the behavior of others, we do a couple of filtering processes. One is we look to see if it's out of the norm. Is this unique? Is it distinctive? And is there consensus around us as far as what this means? So for instance, if we look at, I remember when my father was teaching me to drive, we'd be at a stoplight, and he looked at me one time and he said, you realize there's very little difference in the colors, red and yellow here, because they're both very orange. So you have to know where the light is in reference to top, middle, or bottom. which I thought was quite odd because they looked very red and very yellow to me. Clearly, he had colorblind issues, and if you saw him dressed, you would know that that was really the case. So uh, we look around to see if people around us and the world around us also forms a similar consensus. The last factor is consistency, and is this a consistent pattern? We all come to our perceptions with biases, and the various biases that we hold are formed throughout our life based on our experiences, and as I mentioned before, our education and our upbringing, our family background, all kinds of inputs. One of them that's very strong and is prevalent in the workplace is what we call the Pygmalion effect, or self-fulfilling prophecy, which means that if someone believes they can do something, or conversely cannot do something, and they're told this over and over again, they begin to believe themselves, and it can become a reality. And this is something that is also very prevalent in parenting, which is why parents are often told to reinforce positive behavior and let their children know that they can do certain things, as opposed to shutting down their attempts at overcoming barriers. In the workplace, this diagram kind of gives you an idea of how this looks. If a supervisor expects certain things, or an employee expects certain things from a supervisor, then that is the beginning of this chain reaction. And we look to see if our expectations are met by actual behavior. And for instance, if we expect our supervisor to always be negative, we will look for reinforcing things about that. And we may give that feedback continually. And at some point, the supervisor may actually become more negative in their comments and everyday interactions. Other perceptual errors that we have, I've put a few of these up here. I took this from a different source, but they're very similar to what you saw in your book, but I wanted to give you some other input. One is called the halo effect. It's where one trait is so overwhelmingly positive or negative that we use that to attribute overall view of a person or their actions as positive or negative. So for instance, if you're interviewing an applicant for a job, and that person discusses a background in volunteering for a specific nonprofit, and you are so enamored with that you overlook all of the other signals that may indicate that this is not a good employee. The primacy effect is first impressions. Many of us feel that we can make a first impression about a person and it's always correct, and so we stick with that. We do know that first impressions are powerful. We teach that also in HR management and in interviewing and that sort of thing, where it's important to make a good first impression because of what we consider to be the primacy effect. It takes a long time to overcome a strong first impression. Recency effect is something that we see often in performance evaluations, where supervisors, or people in general, but in terms of the performance eval, the supervisor looks at the most recent activity and behavior of an employee, and typically that's the last couple of weeks, even if it's an annual review. And that will dominate their perception of this person and their behaviors. The last one I have up here is called false consensus effect, and that's this like me sort of effect. If you believe that, we know from our research that people are very comfortable with others who have similar views and backgrounds, and so we often, and then we see this also in interviewing, we often see that managers will choose to hire people who are similar to themselves. And it's a comfort level thing. And so you can, in your perceptions of others, find certain characteristics that appear to be similar to the ones that you value, and overestimate the extent to which that other person has them more of those characteristics. idea of perception and expectation in the workplace is very important. When I teach management class, I often say, for me, the two most powerful words in management are expectation and perception. And that's because they vary from person to person. And what links these together is our actions and our communication skills. But our level of motivation is often reflected in how we interpret our expectations of our workplace, our supervisors' expectations of us, etc. And so it's very important. And motivation in the workplace is a key area of study in management and organizational behavior. When I've done some consulting, that's one of the first questions I get from managers is how do I motivate my employees? Which it brings a question unto itself, which is, do you actually motivate other people? Or is that something that must come from them? So keep that in mind as we talk a little bit about motivation. Here's a definition up on the screen: a state of mind, desire, energy, or interest that translates into action. And so I think of motivation as that catalyst that spurs our thoughts into action. It has a strong behavioral component, and it has a lot of correlation with certain elements of performance. So we see that as very important. A key factor that we look at in organizations for employees and motivation is job satisfaction, which is how somebody feels about their specific job. It is really a feeling and an attitude towards one's job. Now, job satisfaction is a more global term, and it can actually be encompass many things. It could encompass the location of the job, your coworkers. Oftentimes, people will stay in a job where they hate the work itself, but they really love their coworkers. And I think many of us have experienced that. Or they love what the organization stands for. So motivation itself, what really pushes us into action, has much deeper roots than all of these different categories that make up job satisfaction. So again, it's very important because we see a correlation between employee motivation and indicators of improved or increased employee performance. There's not a direct cause effect, but we do see a correlation, which makes it pretty important. So performance is a function of three things, as you see up on the screen. First of all, an individual has to be motivated and willing to perform a task or a job, but they also have to have the ability to perform. And then given those two factors, they need the opportunity in which to actually perform the task. So here's a diagram I took from your textbook, which shows these three, linking them to job performance. And when we look at motivation, two areas that seem to are at the heart of an individual motivation are what we call drives and needs. So drives are fundamental needs, innate motives, that sort of thing. And you can see again, the definition on the screen: neural states that energize individuals to correct deficiencies or maintain an internal equilibrium. So in other words, we're driven by certain internal needs for balance or some sort of specific environment around us. And if it's out of sync, we will be driven to bring that back together. In terms of needs and motivation, many of you are familiar with Abraham Maslow's work in the late 20th century. And he developed Maslow's needs hierarchy theory. And he hypothesized that there are innate needs that humans have a need to fulfill. And typically we start at the bottom of the pyramid and start with things like security, food, shelter, those sorts of things. And then next level is safety. And then we move, once those are satisfied, up into the social realm of belonging to social groups and needing interaction with other humans. etc., and on up the pyramid through to self-esteem and self-actualization. And Maslow felt that it was important to satisfy the lower level needs to a certain extent before people could move on to the next level, but didn't see it as a theory where people jumped around. And there's been more recent work by Alderfer which suggests that people can jump around in the pyramid as their circumstances change. A contemporary of Maslow's is James McGregor, and he devised what we call Theory X, Theory Y. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a fairly popular theory. By the way, I wanted to just backtrack a bit on Maslow. The research on Maslow's theory in terms of its usefulness in the workplace has been difficult to validate, and some of that is because we're surveying humans whose needs and attitudes and feelings change, and typically it's a self these are questionnaires where people are answering based on themselves, not observations from outside individuals looking at them. And so it has a strong bias and can change over time. As a manager out in the field, I can tell you that I subscribe to this, and I did use it as part of my, I integrated it into my management style. As did I believe in Theory Y. Theory X is a conventional assumption that basically workers are somewhat lazy. They're only motivated when somebody stands over them and threatens them with punishment if they don't do a job, that given the opportunity, they will not perform a task, and so they need somebody watching over them at all times. Theory Y suggests that people actually do want to perform at higher levels. They want to be able to feel good about accomplishments and achievements and take pride in who they are in their work. And that given an opportunity and an environment which is positive and where the lower level needs of salary and physical needs are satisfied, they will then rise to a higher level of engagement in the workplace. And as a manager, I can tell you that I found this to be true on a practical level. Another theory is McClelland's theory of needs, where his research has a very strong basis, and he found that there are three primary needs for workers and leaders and managers in the workplace, and those are achievement, affiliation, and power. That each of us has some of this mix of all three things are prevalent in our mix of what motivates us, but we have a need to satisfy them in different levels. So the diagram at the bottom suggests that this individual has a stronger need to satisfy power. Affiliation would be the manager who has a stronger need to be well liked by coworkers and employees, and is probably an individual who has a strong need for affiliation struggles to be a really strong manager because of that. So we have these three learned needs that develop over time as we mature and move into the workforce. Now, I will say that in terms of the need for power, it can be, as you see the very last bullet, it talks about personalized versus socialized power, in that a person who subscribes or ascribes to be in a powerful position to do good or for the benefit of others or the community is not necessarily a negative thing. That is very strong in excellent leaders. So when you think of someone like Martin Luther King or Gandhi, their desire to have a great influence with others was for the greater good. A theory that I subscribe to as well is Herzberg's theory of motivation. It's called a two-factor theory, in that there are certain qualities that really encourage people to and motivate people to perform at higher levels. There are also factors that don't necessarily motivate people, but can be such factors of dissatisfaction that they are what we call demotivators. And Herzberg actually called those hygiene factors. So I've listed some of those on the screen. So if you look at these, reading through them, you can see that really the hygiene factors kind of coincide with Maslow's lower level order needs. And the motivating factors really are farther up the chain. And so together, and again, Herzberg was a contemporary as well of McGregor and Maslow. So these theories begin to fit together. And as I'm reading on the discussion board, I can see that many of you also view that there's no one theory for motivation. The expectancy theory of motivation is fairly common among discussions in the classroom with students as well. And they don't know they're talking about the expectancy theory of motivation, but they talk about expectations and fairness and justice in the workplace, which also is strong in the next one we'll talk about, which is equity theory. The idea of the expectancy theory is that if I put in a certain level of effort, that will translate into a certain level of performance. So if I work extra hard and train and learn to do this job better, I will perform at a higher level. And then the next step is if I perform at this higher level, I will receive an outcome that is, one, I value, and two, is positive. So now you could use this in reverse, which is if you put in less effort, perform less, the outcome would be negative. Of course, typically that's not something that people value. So when we talk about balance, we're talking about value. So the rewards that people receive have to be something they value. Students talk a lot about a lack of fairness or justice in the workplace, and how they will work hard and perform at a higher level and then be given a very small reward, which is almost a slap in the face. So you can see where this is an important theory to understand, and I also think it has a strong place in the workplace. Goal setting theory, something that students are very familiar with. Most students that I work with are strong goal setters. We see it heavily used in the business field because we tend in our discipline to want to get things done. And there's an acronym for goal setting that you'll probably have already come across in your other classes. It's called SMART. And as you can see, it stands for specific goals. They need to be measurable, so we know how we're doing. They also need to be achievable. We talk about stretch goals, so they can be stretched and something that challenges us, but they also need to be achievable and reasonable and have a timetable so that it's not like the marathon that you're running where the finish line keeps moving forward every mile that you go. Strengths-based coaching is an important part of this because we're looking at the individual's potential and building on those strengths rather than trying to fix their weaknesses. And when you think about it, this makes far more sense because when you can make someone's weaknesses irrelevant, you can assign them job duties that really match their strengths better than their weaknesses. And again, this is a really strong connection to human resource management, and in particular the development and training of employees. But people really do want feedback, and they really do get excited when they can be passionate about their work. And typically we like what we do well, and we do well what we like, right? I mentioned justice and equity. So these become very important in the workplace as well. There are a couple of different, if you look at the center two boxes, there are a couple of different aspects to justice in the workplace. The first is how our decisions are distributed among employees, and so were they fair? So if Susie gets a $2 raise and Johnny gets a $1 raise, was that a fair distribution, and why? Procedural justice is really about how we got to the decision. So if Sally gets a $2 raise, was it because the boss likes her, Or was it because she showed up for work every day? Or was it because she had a higher level of quality work and output as measured by the organizational benchmarks? So both are very important, and they affect how we respond in the workplace. They affect our emotions, how we feel about our jobs. They affect our attitudes towards our workplace. And then in turn, both emotions and attitudes really affect our behavior in the workplace. So I mentioned equity theory when I was talking about the expectancy theory. And really what it says is that outcome and input ratio are in balance. So we tend to compare what we do, our contributions at work, with the contributions of those around us. And in comparing them, if we perceive that they seem fairly equal, so in other words, my coworker, Sam, performs at a similar level I do, and we are paid very similarly. Sam might be paid slightly more if he started a little bit before me in terms of time on the job. But that as long as those are in balance, we feel pretty good about it. And we also compare ourselves as employees to others in our industry, not just within our own organization. Now, if we perceive that these are not in balance, then this can become a point of dissatisfaction. If we feel that our contributions exceed those around us or exceed what we receive in response, then we are unhappy, and we have, either we have to figure out a way to ask our employer to adjust the inequity, or oftentimes we end up moving on to a different position. Interestingly enough, the research shows us that if we perceive that we are paid or rewarded more highly than we should for our contributions, that we're okay with that, which is kind of interesting. Another, as we move towards the end of our motivation theories, is the reinforcement or behavioral theory. This is based on B.F. Skinner's work, as many of you are probably fairly familiar with this. And this is about controlling an individual's behavior by cause and effect. So using positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment as a way to reinforce the behavior we want to see. And we've heard this over and over again. Be careful what you reward, because that is likely the behavior that you will see. And all of these begin to affect what we call employee engagement. We know that employee engagement is important in organizations and in terms of employee performance. So the first bullet gives you a definition, and it really speaks to both the cognitive, irrational, and emotional attachment and commitment people have to their workplace and to their companies. And it is affected by a variety of things, including the environment around them and leadership, managers, that sort of thing. Now, we can see that high levels of engagement have some very positive indicators in the workplace, which we would like to encourage. So how do we increase employee engagement? There are some ideas up on the screen. One is to involve people. The word that is often used, which is maybe used a little bit too much, but is a good word, is called empowerment. So in other words, involve people and allow them to be part of the process, and care about employees. Showing that they have value is very important. Lastly, when we know, for many of us who study leadership, that authenticity and transparency is becoming an incredibly important movement within the leadership field. And that's because it builds trust, and trust becomes important in terms of employee engagement and development of a positive employee culture within organizations. The opposite can lead to workplace stress. And so in your book dedicated an entire chapter to stress, which I found interesting. And also I think it shows us that stress in the workplace is continuing to rise, and it's being talked about more. So it's kind of coming out of the closet. And again, I offer a definition, and this one did come from your textbook, defined as individuals physiological, behavior, and psychological responses to perceived challenges and threats. So think about that. It's not just all in your head. This has to do, and I saw this a lot in healthcare. We had a number of patients who came in that had physical symptoms, but when you peel away the layers and remove a great stress in their life, help them remove that, oftentimes the physical symptoms reverse themselves. So stress can be a very, very powerful thing in our lives. And a lot of times it has to do with adaptation and change. And I apologize for the typo in the second bullet. I'll have to change that. But we don't want to eliminate all stress because not all stress is bad. There are a couple of kinds of stress, but the negative stress is, as I said, powerful and can have a great effect on organizations and on people. So you can see job stress alone, there's an estimate that it costs American businesses $300 billion a year in things like absenteeism and turnover and medical, legal, insurance fees. It can lead to depression, and then the costs go up even higher. So again, we can't avoid all stress, and probably shouldn't, because there are positive aspects to certain types of stress. And so some stress can be beneficial, and if you think about it, if you've ever been part of an athletic competition, either on a team or as an individual, waiting for the game to begin or the race to begin can be stressful, building up to that. But it also heightens our sense of achievement and sparks us on to doing greater things. So a bit of stressful challenge can be a good thing, and we call that eustress, which comes from a Greek word meaning good, as opposed to distress, which is a negative type of stress. So we can see that when there's too much negative stress, that is very problematic. But also, if we have no stress, it can actually lead to a very apathetic performance at work. So if people are in very mundane jobs that don't challenge them intellectually or physically or motivationally, they can become so apathetic that their performance actually suffers. And this is another diagram that I took from your textbook, which lists some of the things that can add stress to your life, whether in your personal life or in your organizational life. And there are many more, I'm sure. We didn't even add up there being a student, which adds a lot of stress, and I'm hoping some of that is eustress rather than distress. So how do we cope with and manage stress? Stress is something that we all need to look at as part of organizations. And I think recognition is probably the most important thing that many of us are not good at, and we don't recognize it, and we'll often be in denial until it's too strong. So here's some ideas of things to take a look at. Before we finish, I did want to touch on the idea of creativity. I myself have not in the past viewed myself as a creative person. And so I think that for some people this can be a topic that they shy away from. But we're not talking about creativity in terms of simply being able to draw or sing or that sort of thing. But idea creation is very important in organizations. So here are some definitions of creativity. And when you think about it, words like novel and transforming something into value, something new, those sorts of things are important in organizations. So it can be looked at from many different standpoints, as you see up on the screen. And your book did a really good job of talking about these, so I think that they're fairly self-explanatory. But again, what the message is, we're taking a very broad view of creativity. Innovation is a word that we hear often in organizations, and this is strongly linked to creativity. And so here we're talking about creativity and the generation of new and useful ideas, but innovation as the implementation of those ideas. So in organizations and companies, we need both. And since the world is continually changing around us, we need to be in a very adaptive, creative mode much of the time. So who's a creative person? Here's some ideas about some people who are perceived to be creative. Interestingly, above average intelligence, persistent, um, knowledge and experience, which is interesting. You think creative people don't necessarily have a lot of traditional knowledge, and very open to new experiences, um, lower need for affiliation, which means that they're not as worried about what the people around them think or what the group thinks. They're very okay putting out a new idea all by themselves. And work environments that are learning environments open to new ideas and change, those that encourage experimentation and idea creation and tolerate mistakes, are usually very creative environments. And open communication is also very important. And so those are things that we want to ascribe to as we think about our organizations. So how do we make our approach more creative? So here are some ideas, things to look at. You can each take a moment and read through this list. Pick out one or two really is your barrier. For me, sometimes it's being too logical. And the last one, considering myself creative. So, how about you? Think about which ones are for you. One that I actually do like is break the rules sometimes. And we're not talking about major rules or going to jail. We're talking about taking some good calculated risks, stepping outside of ourselves once in a while. So I hope that helped, and I look forward to reading your discussions on the topics on this module. And if you have any questions, as always, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thanks.